Chapter 9. Bobby was squatting on the porch over the stack of newspapers, tugging on the twine that held them, his small, dirty fingers making little headway against the knot. "You cut it, dummy," Joel said, pulling out his pocket knife, "like this." He cut the twine on the papers and also on the stack of inserts next to them, his hands moving with angry impatience. Bobby watched, his lower lip poking out. "You know I don't got a knife." "Don't have," Joel corrected gruffly, looking away from Bobby's face. "You don't have a knife." "Well, I don't," Bobby said, and he grabbed an advertising circular and stuffed it inside a paper, crumpling both. "Take it easy," Joel ordered, thumping Bobby on the head with the handle of his knife. "You're going to mess everything up." Bobby's face rumpled and he began to cry. "That hurt." He rubbed the top of his head. "Everything hurts," Joel mumbled. But now the anger was replaced by shame. What was he on Bobby about? The poor little kid was only trying to help. Joel began pulling the circulars off the stack one at a time, snapping them into place inside the fold of the newspapers, rolling the papers to ready them for throwing. "Everything hurts," he repeated to himself, "except maybe being dead. Being dead's probably the only thing that's easy." The thought made his skin go cold and tingly. "What's wrong, Joel?" Bobby asked. "Why do you look like that?" His own pain forgotten, Bobby was staring with enormous green eyes. "Nothing," Joel said, but the word came out sounding squeezed. "If you're going to help, start putting the papers in the bag." Bobby began bagging the papers, but he didn't take his eyes off Joel's face. "Watch what you're doing," Joel snapped, pulling the anger around himself like a cloak. "We've got to get this show on the road." Bobby nodded sharply and set to loading the rolled papers into the bag as fast as Joel could get them ready. Joel stuffed and rolled, the fury taking over again, but this time he knew whom he wanted to punch. It was all Tony's fault, all of it. Tony knew what a poor swimmer he was. He had to have realized the risk, and now he'd gone off and left Joel to answer for him. And what was he going to say? Tony's parents would probably be asking questions by the time he got home from his route. "Tony isn't home, Joel. Where could he be? You're the last one who saw him alive." "Damn it all anyway," Joel cried, pushing the rest of the stack of papers off the porch. "I'm sick of this stinking paper route." Bobby was sitting back on his heels, his eyes in danger of swallowing up his face. He peered over the edge of the porch and then up at Joel. "You squashed 3 of Mommy's purple things," he said. Joel looked too. The papers were lying in the middle of his mother's petunia bed. "Do you want me to get the papers back?" Bobby asked. "I think if we brush them off, they'll be okay." "All right," Joel consented. "Get them back." Bobby climbed down the steps and then up again. He peered cautiously over the stack of papers he carried. "They're okay, Joel," he said, laying them down reverently as though they were jewels. Joel shook his head, trying to dispel the red fog that had taken possession of his brain. If he could get his hands on Tony now, he would... But that was ridiculous. What would he do? What could anybody do? Beat Tony up? At the thought, he let out a choking guffaw, half laughter, half sob. Bobby was watching him again, his face weary, his lower lip clenched between small white teeth. "Are you okay, Joel?" he asked. "Yeah," Joel said, "I'm okay." He went back to preparing the papers. "I'm alive, aren't I?" The paper route seemed endless. Bobby rode behind Joel on the bicycle seat and chatted the whole way. Joel tried to listen with half an ear anyway, but he couldn't. With each thunk of a paper on a porch, he heard instead Tony's voice, challenging, teasing. "I bet you can't get one in the middle of Mrs. McCullough's hanging geraniums. I bet you can't clip Smith's cat. Why don't you..." Joel wanted to yell at Tony, to tell him to shut up, but even Bobby would think he was crazy if he started yelling at a voice inside his own head. Why did he feel so responsible, as though he had pushed Tony in? Why did he always have to feel responsible for everything that happened? If they'd gone climbing on the bluffs and he, Joel, had fallen, Tony wouldn't have blamed himself, would he? Tony had said once that Joel was like an old grandmother, fretting all the time. Well, Tony ought to see him now. He would laugh. At the thought of Tony laughing, Joel almost smiled. He and Tony always had so much fun together. Besides the tree house they were building this summer, they had a lot of other projects going. They always did. For one thing, they had been pooling their allowances to buy a worm farm. Their plan was to get rich selling bait. Tony had even had the idea of using his mother's meat grinder to grind whatever worms were left at the end of the summer and sell them as goldfish food. That was because Joel's father had pointed out that neither family would want worms multiplying in the basement over the winter. For his part, Joel was skeptical about whether there were very many people anxious to buy worm mash for goldfish food, but he hadn't said that to Tony. Last summer, they had concocted a wonderful scheme for getting rich, selling decorative pennies. They flattened 50 pennies by leaving them on the tracks to be run over by the 3:45 train, turning them into thin, coppery discs. Their plan hadn't been exactly what anybody could call successful, though. They sold only 1 penny because every other kid in town knew how to flatten pennies, too. The one they sold for a nickel was to a prissy girl whose mother wouldn't allow her to go near the tracks. They had been left with 49 pennies they couldn't spend, not even in a gumball machine. Joel tossed the last paper and turned his bike towards home. Bobby had finally fallen silent, and Joel was grateful for that. He could feel his brother's small, hot hands gripping his shirt and the puffs of breath on the back of his neck, so close, so alive. A surge of protectiveness passed through Joel. He would have to teach Bobby how to swim. Bobby was afraid even to get his face in the water. Joel would start working with him right away. Every kid needed to know how to swim. Sometimes parents didn't seem to realize what a dangerous place the world is. When Joel turned the corner by his house, he could see his mother and father in the front yard talking to Mr. and Mrs. Zabriskie. Seeing the 4 of them standing there, their faces solemn and intent, sent a chill through Joel's bones. What were they talking about? What did they know? By now, someone must have seen through his lie, or maybe the teenage boy had come back and turned Joel in. Joel coasted up the driveway and stepped off his bike, pushing it into the garage before Bobby had a chance to climb down. Inside the garage, he scooped Bobby off the seat and set him on the floor. "Thanks, buddy," he said. "I appreciate your help." He propped his bike along the wall out of the way of the cars. "I'll help you again tomorrow, Joel," Bobby said, his face glowing in the semi-darkness of the garage. "We'll see," Joel said, patting Bobby's shoulder. He began tinkering with his bicycle, shifting the gears back and forth uselessly, pretending to be engrossed. Bobby watched him for a moment, then turned and headed outside with a one-legged skip. "Mommy, Daddy," he called before he was even beyond the front of the garage. "Joel's going to let me help him with his paper route tomorrow, too." Joel stood where he was, trying to control the way his hands trembled, the way the muscles in his face seemed to jerk. They were talking about him out there. He was certain of it, but there was no way past them without being seen, and if he stayed in the garage any longer, they would probably notice that too. He shifted the gears one last time, slumped his shoulders, and pulled his head in, like a turtle retreating into its shell. Then he stepped out into the staring light of the driveway.